All right, well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Crispin Sartwell, who's taught in many places, most recently Dickinson College, from which he retired, and now is a freelance philosopher, author of many excellent books, and is going to talk to us today about American Realism.
Thanks. Happy to be here. I know there's a lot going on last week and this week around here, so appreciate y'all coming. Yeah, so I did a dissertation largely concerned with Dewey's aesthetics. And I was aware that there were these realist philosophers that called themselves realists in the early 20th century. I might have seen some little slices here and there, mostly in relation to Dewey, maybe, way back in the day. But I guess I dismissed them, these realists, even though I would call myself a realist. I thought they'd been superseded. I thought they were mediocre. That seems to be the rumors I heard about them. I'm trying to remember even from whom or where, right, as I studied American philosophy. And then I wrote my system of philosophy, Entanglements, and I was groping for a theory of truth, and I at least ran into a couple of quotes from William Pepperell Montague, in which he kind of gave a somewhat sketchy version of a theory of truth that I thought was in the right spirit, actually. And I quoted it, but then I went right on to some other stuff, Now, it has occurred to me, though, or at some point it struck me that many of the ideas of my book, like some 3 or 4 of the central ideas of my book, were fully formulated by the quote unquote new realists of the early 20th century. And then I started wondering why I didn't know these ideas, or how I thought they were original to me in some cases, or I thought they were, I attributed them to much more recent figures, including the ones that are on the handout, I guess. So I guess one thing I'm interested in is philosophical reputation, or just academic reputation. Like, why do some people take over and some people fizzle out? And I guess I feel like it's not exactly Darwinian in the sense that the best ideas survive or something like that. I mean, I guess I just did 30, 40 years in academia. And it strikes me that a lot of the ways that ideas get sorted have to do with social and professional configurations, like who is able to eliminate the other guy's graduate students and things like this. All right. So like I'm a little bit, so I got to be a skeptic about the idea that the best ideas keep going and the worst fall by the wayside. Possibly because I felt like I fell by the wayside myself, if you see what I'm saying. And I, of course, didn't think I should have. Right. So, I mean, and I guess you could think about this a little bit. Like, I don't know that the pragmatists like sort of eliminated the realists, but they superseded the realists. I mean, they were pretty friendly, I think, overall. And in a lot of cases, they probably thought that these were fairly compatible, or it's not super immediately clear that they're opposites or something like this. American realism and pragmatism. Dewey didn't think so, really. But the pragmatists superseded. I mean, it was amazing what was going on in realism in the first 20 years of the 20th century. These collaborative groups, like the New Realists. This is a collective book by Edward Holt, Walter Marvin, William Pepperell Montague, Ralph Barton Perry, Walter Pitkin, and Edward Spaulding. And then there was a similar anthology a few years later of critical realism. Again, 6, 7 philosophers, including Lovejoy and Santayana and Roy Wood Sellers. Like, so many people were calling themselves realists. And, if you had been sitting there in 1915 And they did say things like this. You say, like, this is the realist moment, okay? And this is the emerging American philosophy, and not only American, I guess. They connected to Bergson and also to Moore and Russell. But okay, so, but for one reason or another, the pragmatists superseded them, and then were superseded in their turn by by analytic philosophy. And I think probably, a lot of people who are interested in pragmatism think that was a mistake in a certain way. I mean, like, in other words, we lost a bunch of stuff that we really should have continued to explore and develop, man. Like the history of American philosophy got kind of short-circuited at that moment when analytic philosophy took over in this really thorough, disconcerting way that, maybe we all lived through in one dimension or period or another. Now, I'm also real interested in this moment around, the first decade of the 20th century, which is, I feel like, a really pivotal moment in Western philosophy. Or, I mean, we could take it 1890 to 1915 or, 14 or something, or I'm not sure exactly how to do the periodization. But, the 19th century seemed to the people who emerged in the late 19th century to be so controlled by idealism, so distorted by idealism, so thoroughly idealized. I mean, this might even be true of some of the British, it's true of British idealists, obviously, but even like, say, Mill, someone like that, who's working on phenomenalism, in various ways, has an account of physical objects as bundles of experiences or whatever it might be. Does he? I should look that up again. So like, and a sense that this has been enforced and that this idealism, all the different strands of idealism, at their center, they're anti-science. Okay, they're not going to be compatible with science, even if you wish they were. Wish it was. Okay, so what would we do if we didn't have idealist commitments? If we dropped that whole thing, if we ignored Kant and Hegel, what would we do? And suddenly it seems like everything is possible. Okay. I mean, for one thing, Kant and Hegel are overwhelming figures that, there's no escape from Hegel, right? Once you wander into Hegel, there's no refuting Hegel, right? He just blows like a blob of goo, what I mean? Like, he just dialecticizes them, or whatever. There's like, I think there was a palpable feeling of entrappedness. And I do think also that, I mean, I don't want to start talking about the American character, I guess, or whatever. I should really hesitate to do that. But I don't think that Hegel's idealism feels that American to me. Like, all right. So like, although there were American Hegelians, obviously, and even sort of dominant in academic philosophy in the US even, which seems almost amazing. But okay, so, so if Americans are practical people, these are kind of things that, was being said even then. All right, well, how practical is Hegel really, How practical is just even the task of reading Hegel? Really? Yeah. So I don't know. So I think a bunch of really fascinating things emerged actually all over the West, around in this period of like the next generation of the next iteration of philosophy. I guess I think of 1890 to 1910 maybe as the era in which modern philosophy finally came to an end. And I guess I do kind of diagnose modern philosophy as a descent into idealism. We can argue about any of this if you want. Okay. So like, yeah, we start out with some kind of scientific, like sort of Locke anticipating Newton or something like that. and we end up in a world in your head. So is that what science studies? Is that where science is going, into your head? Or is it going into space? Or, so yeah, I mean, the period around the turn of the 20th century was the scientistic period par excellence. Very similar now, I think, in a way. Although we might have somewhat different views about what science is or what it demands. So I think that's what kind of led people to supersede a lot of 19th century philosophy, that they didn't regard it as compatible with. Look, I mean, I just even say this, like British empiricism has nothing to do with science and is basically incompatible with science. Like, it doesn't help science. Like, if you're thinking of like, what, I'm when I look in that telescope, I'm experiencing my own ideas. Okay, I'm having sense impressions. That's only thing I have access to is sense impressions. Now, does that help any scientific inquiry? All right. I mean, is that something a scientist should do? Is like first sort out the map the sense impressions? Are scientific papers about the scientist's sense impressions? They can only be about that, I guess, right? If you're Locke or Hume or whatever. I just think the history of modern philosophy is in incredible tension with the history of modern science. I think they're opposed to one another, actually. I think modern philosophy is a rear guard action on behalf of spirit or something like that. You know what I mean? Like an attempt to hold on in a situation in which science is threatening this a kind of spiritual universe. So I think that the period around 1905 was really an exciting period in various places, and Moore and Russell are working on this. Phenomenology is arising. These are all attempts to like sort of get back to the world from wherever we have been for the last 100 years, in our consciousness or something like that. Okay, so fascinated by this period, and then I guess fascinated specifically by the new realists as opposed to the critical realists and stuff. One thing I realized about myself, not that you have to be that interested in this, is that I want my criteria of theory choice to be only verific, that is only dedicated to the truth, all headed toward the truth. But I've had to realize about myself that I tend to select theories by how cool they seem to me, how perverse the positions are. Yeah. Like if you don't take a series of extreme, surprising positions, I dismiss you from the outset. I'm not going to read your book. For real. For real. Okay. Like the most reasonable philosophers to me seem like the ones I just have no interest in at all. Okay. But anyway. So, and I think like, for example, yeah.
Who would that be? Most recent philosopher that you have no interest in.
John Rawls. Or people who are really mainstream. I'm trying to think of a bunch of good examples. I guess political philosophy is what hits me. Like, am I going to read another 10 books on liberalism, classical liberalism, and how it's endangered? Or it's, I mean, I sort of know, I feel like I can rehearse the arguments without help in a way, like, because I've seen a lot of them for a very long time. I guess in my head, I sort of think, who's beeping? Are we beeping? Am I beeping?
Oh, it's the library.
All right.
We're going this way.
Library's beeping. Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking for stuff out of the mainstream, but I'm sort of trying to critique this about myself a little bit too, in the sense that I really do think it should just be about what's true. And so I worry about myself in this way. And I also realize some people go the opposite way, like what seems odd, unusual, surprising, extreme, that it gets dismissed. Right? I think either of those you tend to lose the truth. Like either you want to be mainstream or you definitely don't want to be mainstream, right? And either way, that's not quite relevant to whether what you're saying is true or not. But I mean, one thing about 1905 or whatever is that it becomes possible to articulate very radical philosophical positions in mainstream philosophy. So these new realist guys, Holt, Marvin, Montague, Perry, Pitkin, and Spaulding, they're all at Ivy League schools, except maybe Pitkin was at Michigan or something like that. Okay, so Spaulding's at Princeton. Like all these people were grad students at Harvard. They also, they studied with Royce and James, all of them, I think. And but then they started taking these really seemingly quite perverse, radical, difficult positions. And I think that's possible because it's this moment, and that's not really what you expect from Ivy League professors. From Ivy League professors, I expect rote conventionality, I have to say, okay? Just like overweening conventionality. Like who's the big moralist at Harvard? Like, how about all the ethicists emerged from Harvard over the last 30 years? I think it's Dahl. Okay. Kierkegaard? Yeah. Okay. But these guys are ensconced in distinguished chairs at Princeton and stuff, okay? There are 3 of them are at Columbia, and they're working with Dewey. That's why this, overlaps with Dewey, because Dewey's writing these conversations once he arrives at Columbia. This is a moment where a distinguished professor at Princeton can suddenly take a series of surprising positions because we don't know exactly what happens after idealism, right? We're still groping for how to express what's gone wrong and where we're headed, and pragmatism is just emerging, and phenomenology is just emerging, and analytic philosophy is just emerging, and everyone's wondering, like, how is this going to go? Like, how are we going to write, for one thing? Like, what's the writing style be like? But then also, like, what are eligible ideas if we abandon this whole structure of ideas that we were trained in, And so I feel like it's a moment kind of ripe with possibility that is fun. All right, so I got this handout, 3 ideas. And I guess I want to focus on the third one, the last one, values as situations. But I'll just run through briefly the other 2 as well. Should probably keep track of the time somehow. All right, so at SAP this year, Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, we did a panel on New Realism, and I read a paper in which I claimed that the New Realists invented the extended mind thesis. Now, there are other candidates, and Randy was hitting me with Bergson this morning vociferously. Okay, we got to figure out what year that was and stuff too, baby.
1988.
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, well, I guess we have. That was easy. And I guess at SAP, I also heard people say Peirce had a version of this earlier, actually. And I've seen some quotes that indicate that Peirce. I'm not sure it was developed systematically, but okay. So I'm not that confident anymore in like straightforwardly attributing extended mind to the New Realists. But a whole bunch of them, several of them, formulated it as clearly as it can be formulated, I think. And especially Ralph Barton Perry, who's a person I really admire. Been arguing with Randy about this too. A philosopher I really admire. I know I said maybe this was a little bit of a provocation that realism is the characteristically American philosophy. But Ralph Barton Perry wrote a book called Characteristically American. How about that, man? Dewey never wrote a book called Characteristically American. Wait, did he? No. Okay, good. Good. All right. It's a nice little book too, actually. Nothing really incompatible with Dewey about it, either, I'd say. Democracy is characteristic American, openness, hope, things like this, I don't know what we think now about those things. Yes, but anyway, at least the extended mind thesis got beautifully explicit and elaborate formulations by the new realists. And I've got, I assembled a whole big anthology of quotes for the SAP paper. Holt is really good on this, but, mental content consists of portions of the surrounding environment illumined by the actions of the organism. That is what I'm experiencing. This is just an immediate attack on empiricism and idealism. What I'm experiencing is not my idea of this book, which actually doesn't help us account for anything, I would say, but it is this book. It's amazing to have to say that after 300 years, I think. I don't know. And people just go like, obviously you're insane, whatever, but okay. Because I saw a book, I'm insane. Yeah. No, I saw an idea. No, you can't see an idea. Anyway, there will still persist, I feel sure, a belief to the effect that mental content can never be known in this way. That is, from a point of view external to the person having that content. And one thing that they're experimenting here with, especially Holt, is Edwin Holt, is behaviorism, early behaviorism. They're engaged with this. Even the picture of each mind as locked within itself, which comes with modern philosophy. That is, I'm having the ideas I'm having, and you can't have the ideas I'm having. In fact, I'm experiencing you as a series of ideas. You are, for me, a series of my ideas, etc. So that to say this appears bizarre or radical, but on the other hand, it appears very commonsensical. And you can see like Wittgenstein and Quine, for example, are going to go in this direction. Like you're saying that there's a mysterious internal essence of the mental, and that we are separated from each other profoundly by that fact that I can't access your consciousness and you can't access mine. And these philosophers are experimenting with the idea that that's just false. And they're doing it in a pretty commonsensical way too. Like, okay, no, if you say I can't know whether you're angry or not, I think I'm perfectly clear on that. Actually, in most situations, all right, there could be a situation where someone is concealing their feelings or whatever. I often know, often know exactly what someone is experiencing. I think. I mean, this is just, common to our lives. We're experiencing the same world in a given day. So maybe we should affirm that at the base of our philosophy. It's customary to look for content within the body and then solemnly declare that it's not to be found. Though long since theoretically discredited, I was puzzled by that. That's my question mark there. The subcutaneous mind still haunts the imagination of everyone who deals with this problem. But why not look for the object where it belongs and where it is easily accessible, namely in the environment? Is it not in truth the environment which the amoeba or any other organism is sensing? If then we are in search of content, why take so much pains to turn our backs on it and look for it where by definition it must escape us? So when you start with a realist presumption, or you start with deleting idealism or whatever, a lot of possibilities open up. Okay, like for example, that we can know each other, right? And we do, like in a very ordinary, all the time kind of way. I'm not often puzzled about what you're feeling or what you're seeing. I mean, occasionally puzzlements can arise. And then also the idea, I mean, of course, the representationalism, where I'm experiencing a image, a picture of this book on the screen of my mind or whatever, leads to myriad philosophical problems, including external world skepticism, other minds, etc. And so, but what happens if we just delete that? Like, okay, so that seems a self-evident truth that all we experience is our own ideas. But say we doubt that, as well we should. And unlike any philosopher for the last 400 years, or whatever, then what will we say? What are we experiencing if we're not our own ideas? Well, it's just the ordinary objects in our environment. Is that, okay, now we got to try to give an account that doesn't make use of a representational system in consciousness, or doesn't account for consciousness as a representational system. Now, the critical realists, Lovejoy and Sellers, Roy Wood Sellers, and others, they in response to the new realists, they revived the representationalism. So they were representational realists of a kind that you could read Locke as being, for example. Of course, I only have access to my own ideas. No one should have conceded that for a minute. Okay, but anyway, of course, I only have access to my own ideas. But my own ideas, and I can assure myself of this by certain techniques and such, match up to picture accurately the stuff out there, or can under the right circumstances. So that's representational realism, and that's where Sellers went. Yeah.
It sounds like you're arguing for objective. There is something there that is unique to itself. Somehow the interaction with consciousness picks up what is actually there and looks like exactly how you're experiencing it.
Well, under good circumstances, yes.
But would it also
Can we actually hold questions to the end?
Oh, sure, I'm sorry.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
It's our practice.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that one, and remind me as I go on, or after I'm done. Yeah, I think that initial concession, the representational theory of mind, I guess, that's what I think of as the essence of modern philosophy. That's what I think, once you start down that road, you end up in some form of idealism, irresistibly, I think, although they, heroically tried to prevent that representational realists. But I guess I feel like representational realists are liable to get sucked back into this idealist position, and so I'm looking for alternatives, right? And I'm groping toward any formulation of an alternative. Like, it's hard, and so that's why I'm coming back to these folks, because they really struggled at this moment to formulate the alternative, and to do that, they really, essayed some radical solutions for a moment, I would say. Even these philosophers, I guess, I think of the classic books of New Realism as Perry's Present Philosophical Tendencies. It's one of the least prepossessing book titles I've ever heard. Present Philosophical Tendencies. And then the book, The New Rationalism by E.G. Spaulding, which are kind of bookend the movement. And all right, where did I start that thought? Somehow I was, that was a digression from something, but I can't remember from what now. All right, so yeah, and I would say, these philosophers didn't necessarily pay off on this radical moment through their whole careers. You see what I mean? Ralph Barton Perry was not putting forward a radical realist metaphysics 30 years later. He was a much more conventional philosopher, basically a cultural commentator, as a Harvard philosophy professor at that point. So I think this moment, they retreated a little bit too, or this was kind of an experimental moment, to articulate a coherent realist position on these various issues is not that easy. Okay, the identity theory of truth. Now, this is a theory of truth that was put forward almost casually in the very early 20th century in letters and stuff between Russell, Moore, and Frege. There's a letter from Russell to Frege called the Mont Blanc letter, where he says that he thinks that Mont Blanc is part of what is asserted when someone says Mont Blanc is cold. The mountain itself is part of what is asserted. And he seems to be moving toward the idea that propositions are situations in the world. Just situations in the world, not like representations or maps of situations in the world. Now, you might think about what this would do to Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And I think maybe Russell, it may even be that Wittgenstein proved to Russell's satisfaction that this was not going to work, actually, this identity theory of truth. But it's a radical and fascinating and underexplored theory of truth. And it came back up in the 90s. Jennifer Hornsby, a woman named Marion David, did some very interesting work on the identity theory of truth. But it was so clearly stated by Montague. And I mean, this it just surprised me because I really worked on the identity theory of truth. And then suddenly I realized that Montague said something so similar. I hold that, and this is from his paper in the New Realism, Realist theory of truth and error. I hold that the true and false are respectively the real and the unreal, considered as objects of a possible belief or judgment. That's a rich but ambiguous thing to say. I mean, I guess this way I work in entanglements. True, roughly, closely, is a synonym of real. And to say of a sentence or a belief that it's true is to extend the primary meaning of the term. Like, for example, the sentence, my aim is true. All right, that, that doesn't say that there's a proposition and then there's a reality and they map each other accurately. It's doing something in the world. Okay. I think the world is true. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say either. That doesn't sound that bizarre, does it? I mean, it's philosophical, so it sounds pretty bizarre. The world is true. Okay, true and false, it will be said, are adjectives which apply to beliefs, that is, to acts or states of an individual. I don't know if he's directly in dialogue with Dewey at this point. I think he is, though. But I'm not sure how that's affecting this. We do not call objects true or false. We call them real or unreal. This is the objection. Beliefs alone are susceptible of truth and falsity, or maybe propositions or sentences, to which it may be replied that true or false only apply to beliefs in a metonymus or borrowed sense, i.e. in virtue of the relation of the act of believing to the object believed in. There would be no sense in calling an act of belief as such either true or false. But I guess on my account, there would be a sense of calling an act of belief true. That would just be to say that the act of belief was real, that someone actually did believe that, or something like that. I think if you really look at the way true and real operate in language, they overlap like mad. They're used as synonyms. There's certain sentences in which one or the other seems inappropriate, and the other one seems okay. But to say a sentence is real and to say it's true are two different assertions, right? But to say that climate change is true and that climate change is real are exactly the same assertion. So they're close to synonyms, they're overlapping. And I want to look at human beliefs as true or false in terms of, do they preserve the real in some sense? Do they convey the real? Now, when Dewey criticizes the new realists, he definitely accused them of holding like just a straight up raw correspondence theory of truth. And I don't think they did exactly, or at least they were also aware that this was going to create problems for them. And they were experimenting with some pretty radical solutions. Like this is a pretty radical solution. Now, I guess the thing I might be proudest of in my book Entanglements is the account of values as situations. So I guess, how are we doing time-wise? Yeah, this is what I meant the body of this talk to be about, but I guess this will be the last little bit instead. Okay, so I mean, this is the way I started thinking about this. I've been working on beauty for a long time, and I've written a couple of books on beauty. I wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on beauty, and it strikes me. I've been teaching classes on beauty for decades, and it has stricken me for a long time that the claim that beauty is subjective is not good. It's inadequate. It doesn't account for our use of the term at all. It's very poor. And all it says is really like it's not a concept at all. It applies to anything anyone wants to apply it to, and it's true when they do apply it. Like that's not a concept. But the idea that beauty has nothing to do with anybody's pleasure or nothing to do with anybody's response seems crazy too. Like a universe with no subjects, no subjectivities, no consciousness is where no one can have an experience of beauty. That beauty has nothing to do with pleasure or whatever want to say about like what the experience is like. So it could seem to me like, and this is a version of a bigger dilemma in philosophy, like where you're saying it has to be objective, and if it's not objective, then it's subjective, and those are the only two possibilities. Okay, and that just leaves you in a big old mess, right? It definitely leaves you with no plausible account of beauty, no account of beauty that could combine sort of the phenomenology of beauty with the conceptual oomph of an assertion of beauty or something like that. Okay, the content of beauty as a concept. So, I mean, I guess what I found, I quoted G.E. Moore from Principia Ethica. I don't know, if I find this, like there's the whole big section in this book about values as situations. G.E. Moore says this about beauty. It's been commonly supposed that the beautiful may be defined as that which produces certain effects on our feelings. And the conclusion that follows from this, namely the judgment of tastes are merely subjective, that precisely the same thing may, according to circumstances, be both beautiful and not beautiful, has very frequently been drawn. But this is G.E. Moore. But to assert a thing is beautiful is to assert that the cognition of it is an essential element in one of the intrinsically valuable wholes that we've been discussing. An intrinsically valuable whole is the whole situation in which it is being experienced. The object, the subject, and the environment that embeds them both and conveys one to the other. And stuff like this, okay? So the beautiful object, according to Moore, and he's doing this just to open up the discussion of ethics. This is in Principia Ethica. He's not talking about aesthetics primarily, although he returns to it at the end. So the beautiful thing is a feature of the world, because my consciousness is also a feature of the world. And the thing I'm experiencing is also a feature of the world. And everything that we're embedded in is also a feature of the world. In some sense, it's subjective. That is, it exists in the world, a beautiful situation, although it's immensely complicated, right? Like now we can't even, now we're not even exactly just talking about sunset. We're talking about sunset and all the environment that brings it to us and ourselves too. But I think that when you start down this road, really interesting. First of all, I think that's the only plausible way to get to beauty. Like I think that, okay. And so that's a powerful reason to begin a theory of value this way. Although, of course, ethical value and aesthetic value might not be the same thing conceptually or whatever, you know, it might not have the same ontological status. But I think that, like, for example, if we stopped assigning moral responsibility primarily to individual subjects, like, were you responsible for that? And so should you be punished for that? Like, so that seems to be our, like, primary ethical question, right? I think that, and if you thought of other things besides people as real, fully real, in the same sense as people are real, you start assigning responsibility across a situation. So, like, you know, the faulty product, you know, the manufacturer, the messed up use of that product, you know, you didn't use it as the manufacturer said, and you, and, you know, and your dog that knocked it off the table, and the table, and stuff like this. Like, what's really responsible in any moral situation is a bunch of different elements in the whole situation. And that's a kind of insight that Spaulding gives, that I think could have good effects. Like it might relieve us of some of our, you know, like, burden of total unique responsibility. You know, I think, I mean, I haven't been able to publish this really in a way, except in the book, but like, I think inanimate objects can be responsible for stuff. You know, like, I think my computer ate my paper is a pretty good excuse if it's true. You know what I mean? It's the damn computer's fault. And we say that kind of thing all the time, right? Like, my alarm didn't go off. It's its fault. And you know, you could view that as a completely different kind of responsibility, or that's causation, where, as opposed to, you know, moral guilt or whatever. But I think that if we started thinking about moral situations instead of moral agents per se, like, we might at least be able to do different ethics for a while in different directions. All right, so I guess that's my little rap about the new realists. Thanks.
Okay, we'll start with Andre. Go ahead, Andre.
Hi, so much for this talk. So I'm wondering about the question. So what's metaphysics behind new realism? Because, for example, you know, Russell, in his outline of philosophy,
Yeah.
so he identifies, you know, Smart, James, Dewey, and realists like Perry as neutral monists. So I think that neither Mark, James, nor Dewey are neutral monists.
Okay.
But, like, what about new realists? Like Perry. So, I mean, what do you think? Like, is it right to think of them as neutral monists or not?
I'm not sure. Let me work on monism, I guess. I think they did not necessarily agree on matters of ontology. And they say this, like, in the introduction and stuff like this. So, I mean, I have materialist sympathies, and I think that the right metaphysics for realism is materialism myself. Okay, but they definitely did not. Most of them did not. So, as Spaulding is particularly ontologically lush in this regard, but they did a series of distinctions, and maybe this comes from somewhere in early analytic philosophy, between existence and subsistence. And so, like, Spaulding is always talking about, and several of them are, and actually I think their collective manifesto uses this term, like, universals subsist, whereas objects exist. Okay. Maybe Santayana has a somewhat similar ontology with his essences and stuff like this. Now, and I think they were debating about among themselves, but they had a realist, or the official position was a realist account of this. So there really are universals. There really are numbers. They don't exist. They subsist. Okay, now, if they weren't out there independently of our consciousness, if they depended on consciousness, numbers or geometrical figures or universals, you know, okay, I don't know where I keep losing my train of thought here. So yeah, so they introduced this distinction between existence and subsistence. Now, a number of people accuse them of that. That just said that that's pretty squirrely. That's jerry-rigged. I'm trying to remember who raised that objection, but it really does seem jerry-rigged. But so realism could mean like, I'm a realist, I keep reading it this way, and I think I read it this way as I talk, probably. Like it should mean stuff like this, you know, physical stuff in the world. But for a number of these guys, you know, real could also mean abstract, general concepts, whatever objects, but they could not be known unless they were independent. A consciousness can't know unless it is in contact with something that really is. Okay. If the consciousness is creating the thing, then it does not know the thing, right? It only knows itself. So that basic thought led them to start positing the reality of all abstract objects, basically, you know, and all general concepts. Now, is that, I don't know, that doesn't sound monist exactly. I guess if you're recognizing material objects, I don't know, what, like, do you want to say more a little bit about?
I mean, you just, you know, I mean, I'm just like following Russell, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like literal monism is like this idea that because this primal stuff from which mental and physical come from, you know, like, you know, like products or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and like Russell thought that new realists are also literal monists, like all of that.
I don't think so. In that
he mentioned like Perry in particular.
Really, just say that?
Yeah,
I think,
and I just wondering, yes.
Um,
So like what is metaphysics? I mean, if any, monism, and if there is some, is it literal monism or not, or is it all over?
neutral monism,
Right.
is it? Yeah. I guess I hadn't really thought carefully on these terms with Perry or whatever. I don't think they take that position. I think I mean, at least their declared allegiance is to being open to whatever exists. You know, like, and I don't think Spaulding or Perry talks about the underlying identity of things like numbers with things like chairs, you know, or like that they come from the same, they have the same substrate in some sense or something like that. But so I guess I don't think that's right.
Okay.
But I should think more about it and read that Russell again, I guess, too.
Okay.
It's interesting they were in dialogue, right? Yeah, Russell's actually reading Ralph Barton Perry.
Right.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. And Perry's definitely reading Russell. And I mean, they write a little like analytic philosophers, some of them, especially Spaulding, but you can see they're groping for a style they want to be a lot more precise and a lot more concrete and a lot more kind of scientific. And you see them groping toward that, but they haven't fully realized the analytic argumentative style. You know, I guess they still aren't quite Russellian, even though they're reading Russell, you know.
So I'm going to go to a question from Zoom. Let me just invite everybody on Zoom to use the digital raise hand function if you have a question. Also, it'd be lovely if people who felt comfortable turned on their cameras. So, Carl.
Okay, you can hear me okay? Okay. So thank you for that. Yeah, fascinating talk. I appreciate that very much. I've recently taken a strong interest in Holt because of Holt's influence on Gibson, and I've been exploring that whole line of thought extensively in the past couple of years or so. So you had mentioned you started getting into the new realist because you're interested in sort of formulating the extended mind thesis. And maybe could you be willing to like in your view, like who are the contemporary new realists? Like, who are the people today doing philosophy of mind or philosophy of cognitive science who are picking up on this legacy and developing in some ways? Or is this just a gold mine that no one's noticed until now? Or are there people doing new realism without, even if they don't realize it?
Well, I am not necessarily up to speed on contemporary philosophy of mind. You know what I mean? But I mean, extended mind is extremely popular as a philosophy of mind and as fueling research, specific research programs in robotics and stuff like this. I don't know how this stands right now. I was more in this like in the 90s when extended mind really came up. But people in robotics and artificial intelligence were regarding it as absolutely central, like the key corner that we turn. Like you're not going to get a conscious computer, let's say, or an intelligent computer by just futzing with the internal mechanisms in the software. You're going to have to give it sensory inputs, okay? Now this was, like that's a pretty fundamental thought. So I guess I would say Andy Clark, right? But Andy Clark seems to be retreating off of that. Like I don't know. Like I want to get Clark's new book. I'm puzzled to look at Clark's new book because he seems to be, I guess, retreating in some way from that. Now I don't know really what is the consensus position on extended mind now in philosophy of mind or in psychology for that matter. But like Mark Rowlands had I guess I put these on the handout a little bit. Mark Rowlands had a very similar to Holt version of extended mind thesis that he put forward starting around 90. I think anyone who starts with the presumption that the human mind is of necessity embedded in an environment, that if we want to know its essence, we have to look at its surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that is at least to that extent like compatible with the new realism or whatever.
Just one last thought before I stop talking. So one thing you actually might want to think about, and I don't know the literature on this at all, is to what extent Perry would have been an influence on Norbert Weiner, who was coming up with ideas. His cybernetics seems really pragmatist in a lot of ways. And he did study at Harvard in the early 1900s, right? He sort of did his he was a mathematician, but they were all in the same department back then. So there could be a Perry Weiner connection worth looking at some point.
Yeah, and Holt Weiner. Is there a Holt Weiner connection?
That I don't know. I have not looked at the literature on this myself, so I don't really know Weiner's background. But there could be. There could very well be. I don't know.
I'm interested in the connection between Holt and Gibson too, and I haven't really explored that yet, but I intend to, and I know there's some work on this as well.
Yeah, I can. If you want, I can send you an email with some references I've looked at.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Danny?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pivot in a completely different direction from the metaphysics questions to slightly more focusing on theory of truth in relation to ethics, because my concern is what do we mean by the true, the false, the real, the unreal, specifically their boundaries? Because I'm thinking a lot in terms of the conference we had this past weekend in relation of critiquing the limits of who was defined in inclusion. For example, one of the first examples I think of is Holocaust denial in relation to this question. We know the Holocaust was real, but there are still people who deny it, and that's based in anti-Semitism. How does new realism address that?
Well, some of these guys probably would live long enough to see the Holocaust denial. Well, I mean, how do other philosophers address it, I guess? Like, how do other accounts of truth address it? So I guess, like, let's say this. A realistic, I didn't really define new realism or even realism, but so for a realist, and for someone who takes the identity theory of truth in particular, it could easily be the case, and this is true in correspondence theory and other plausible theories, that everyone believes something that's false. Okay, the fact that people deny it has no tendency, bears no relation to whether it's true. Like every conscious being in the universe could think that the Holocaust never occurred, and they'd just all be wrong. And it wouldn't make a dang bit of difference in the truth of that claim. Like consciousness is independent. This has to be formulated with care, but this is the basic new realist position. Consciousness is independent of the reality that it experiences. So it's a hard view of truth, and I think that to deal with disinformation or just like collective hallucination and stuff like this, you want a hard ass notion of the truth, like I think, like, because otherwise, as the consensus floats wrong, the shit becomes true. You know what I mean? And that seems totally plausible to me, and dangerous in cases like this. Like, so if we can manufacture consensus, like we can change the universe, that seems false and evil to me. You know what I mean? Yeah. But it is entailed by theories of truth that connect truth and consciousness intrinsically in some way. Like make consciousness a test or the exclusive scene or site of the truth. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was also thinking in terms of like the history of people's knowledges that are not deemed to align
Yes.
with in terms of colonization as well. So I think that addresses that and how that phenomenon happens.
Yeah, although, you know, like sort of the social epistemology of now is it's not really anticipated in the new realism. You know what I mean? Like this is such a rich development in philosophy now, and it's so central to it. Like you know, how do claims to know function in power systems and stuff like this, and who's listened to and who is dismissed, and whose truth is validated and whose is erased, stuff like this. But I don't think, I mean, you know, like Spaulding in that quote says, like, well, this will help account for disagreements about what is beautiful. And it does, actually, the situational account of beauty. But it doesn't account, it sits there in indifference to the social situations that are producing what we call knowledge and stuff like this. And that could be a problem, right? Like, in other words, like this is a problem for metaphysics in the grand style, which these people are doing. Even though, like, pretty soon you're getting so suspicious of metaphysics, you don't want to do this stuff at all in a way, you know what I mean? Even the pragmatists are suspicious of metaphysics in that sense. But these guys are doing metaphysics in the grand, like, this is what's real. Here's the definition of truth. And that's not, like, I could see one response to that being like, yeah, but that has nothing to do with anything that we're actually worried about as we try to grapple with knowledge on the ground with each other. And like that was really an important thing. And this is an important critique of philosophy in general, right? Like as it once stood, like trying to exempt its concepts. But I guess I'm saying that they have exempted their concept from the social, and that could be a good critique. Of course, it would apply to lots of philosophy, like. But these are social concepts. I can actually see moving back toward a Dewey approach like that. You know, actually knowledge is a social concept. Now, how does it function in conversation and so on? What does it mean, not cosmically, but when we claim to know or deny that someone knows or whatever? And then all these pragmatic considerations and social critiques are opened up again, I suppose.
Okay, PD.
Thanks. This is super interesting. I have questions about the historical situation of the new realists. So going forward, you presented the narrative as they get replaced by the pragmatists, but that I mean, it seems to me that in a way they're after the heyday of pragmatism. The heyday of pragmatism would have been like early 1900s, because by 1912, James is dead. We're years after Will to Believe and sort of pivotal Jamesian texts. Dewey's got career in the future, sure. So I guess the question is two parts, and I apologize for that. The first is, why think that going forward, what happened is that it got supplanted by pragmatism? And I also wonder, why think that it's uniquely novel in rejecting the representationalism that is characteristic of modernity? There is, going back to the late 18th century, the Scottish common sense tradition, which identified the theory of ideas as the big culprit in modernity.
Yeah.
And that tradition, as I understand it, and again, this isn't my area of expertise, but as I understand, the 19th century Scottish common sense philosophy was the dominant thing that got taught at US colleges. And that dissipated at the end of the 19th century, but it was a long-standing tradition, and it was what people taught in the United States. So going forward, why is pragmatism the culprit? And going back, why not common sense philosophy?
All right,
Sorry.
and you might have to remind me here. Yes, common sense philosophy, that's good. Well, I mean, I guess I just think I haven't done the research on the sociology of this, but it seemed like, you know, by the 20s and 30s, if someone had asked, you know, what is the dominant school of American philosophy, no one would have been in any doubt that it was pragmatism. I don't know that 1910 is after the heyday of pragmatism. I mean, I would say it's like right in the heyday of pragmatism, I guess. Dewey is you know, he's already formulated his position, fundamental position, and, you know, but he's still developing in myriad dimensions. James, yeah, died, and he's all these guys' teachers, and they think they're elaborating William James, actually, especially his paper, Does Consciousness Exist? And, you know, Ralph Barton Perry is James's biographer, you know, was sitting on his papers at Harvard and, you know, won a Pulitzer for his biography of James. But so I guess just, I mean, I don't know that there was how the pragmatists came to maybe control most philosophy departments. I mean, I'm not even quite sure if that's true in the US. But I just, somehow realism did not become the dominant philosophy, as like philosophy professors would have understood that, through to the middle of the century. And so I'm wondering why not exactly, because I think it's, you know, I think it has strengths as a philosophy, and it's an interesting relation to pragmatism, you know. Yeah, so, okay, now, Scottish common sense philosophy, yes. I wish that Thomas Reid had taken a more directly anti-empiricist line. Like, I think it's, I wish that I guess I don't think Thomas Reid is that convincing, and I'm not sure that he does get rid of representationalism, but yes, that's the right spirit. And I mean, you know, that's the stuff Thomas Reid says about ideas, I think could fundamentally have cured modern philosophy, and should have. But I don't know, I guess I need to do more research on how dominant common sense philosophy was in 19th century American universities and stuff. I know it was here. I think it's more in keeping with maybe the, you know, sort of frontierish American spirit or something like this, than empiricism, but than classic empiricism. But I don't know, that's a factor that I should really, if I continue to develop this whole, you know, notion of history, that I should take more account of, like right, because I probably started out by saying like idealism was completely dominant in 19th century philosophy, right? And if that sounds simplistic, yeah, I guess it is.
Thanks.
Sorry. Okay, so you mentioned that you're a metaphysical materialist. Maybe. So I'm kind of sympathetic to that line of thinking. And so that's kind of the motivation for my question. But I was interested in your dating because you mentioned 1905 as a moment when you were finally able to formulate some really radical metaphysics, basically, right? Overcoming idealism. I'm glad the question about Scottish realism was posed because, of course, Thomas Reid, you have a pretty convincing critique of Descartes and idealism that already posits, the object is not subordinate to the subject, but somehow experience is composed of these two sort of irreducible terms that are somehow still identical. But anyway, my question is bringing it back to sort of a broader view of history. You mentioned 1905. You also mentioned 1890.
Yeah.
And I'm reading this. I just read this book chapter from 99. Somebody named Haase. But it's on Nietzsche's philosophy of science, and you're interested in scientism as well, it seems.
Yes.
And you mentioned robotics, right? And how this concept of the extended mind is becoming really important. And I'm just wondering how you think this might align with the technological developments, that perhaps technology has advanced much further between the time of Kant and, say, World War I, right, than it did between Descartes and Kant. And actually Emerson has this sort of idea that technology is getting to a point where it already as early as 1870, the technology is getting to a point that it's actually coming to define our being rather than right. And so, I mean, it's this whole existentialist question that I think Nietzsche is being influenced by. And so I was just wondering if you had thought about how this aligns with technology and the material conditions that perhaps we don't need to just look at, examples from within philosophy of people going after idealism, like these folks, but that perhaps they've been struck by the notion that these technological objects that we have sitting in front of us are actually more effective in dealing with problems at the reflection that has traditionally led to idealism. That the role is being reversed here.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. I mean, like I said, I think of the turn of the 20th century as this golden era of scientism. And I think that's in there in how this happened. But I mean, that's all on this abstract level or whatever. But what machines are actually doing in the material world circa 1900, right, is, and I mean, or for, decades before that too, as it came on more and more. Now, okay, so, and various forms of materialism rise in the late 19th century, right? Like Marx, you know what I mean? Like, and Marx is certainly dealing with, obviously, economy, technology, and maybe in the back of Marx's mind, there's this thing that's like, you're playing around with ideas, but they're playing around with, earth movers, okay? Like, what are you talking about? Like, and maybe it's maybe we sort of humans got into a bit of a different relationship with the world at that point, like much more able to alter the world, but also much more having to respect the environment in order to alter it, like not respect it necessarily, but know it in order to alter it. I mean, I think the way technology affects Dewey's philosophy, like a book like Reconstruction in Philosophy or whatever, is really profound, right? Like maybe in some ways the technological mindset is in the pragmatic theory of truth, stuff like this, like teleological. And also a critique of technology, maybe along the same lines, just like what are our purposes? And, but the purpose orientation, which seems technical in a way, I don't know. I would have to think about this a lot more. I don't know, man. Like, how does technological transformation affect your metaphysics in general? All right. Seems like that's a really good question. And then how would the technological innovation around 1900, let's say, 1890, 1905, I was using these dates a little arbitrarily, I guess. How does it affect this moment of specifically abandoning idealism, kind of, or qualifying it or whatever? Seems like a really plausible speculation to me, but I need to grapple, I guess, I should look at the texts again with that in mind. Are they drawing examples along those lines, etc. That's really good. Thanks.
David.
Yes, I enjoyed the paper and I enjoyed the discussion. But let me just concentrate on one point. So in the I wouldn't even call it background, in the foreground of the discussions you're talking about around 1900 is things that popped up from evolutionary theory. Although that went by the name Darwinism, the word Darwinism meant any kind of evolutionary theory for the most part.
Yeah.
In particular, and it's not just that was a stimulus. I mean, the contents of propositions arising from evolutionary biology were entering into philosophy. And so the crucial one I would point out is the proof that there's no such thing as an organism without an environment. Or actually lately people like Lewontin have deduced no such thing as an environment without an organism. But also Dewey's claim that the relationship between the two is the intervening activity that people have, so that your fundamental relation to the world is transformative. It's a very interesting thing that to me that William James, who wrote a obituary for Spencer, praised him, even though he had spent his whole life rewriting that guy's principles of psychology in such a way that it became his own principles of psychology. That was a complete refutation of Spencer, and he would make fun of Spencer. James was not above personal attacks, even though he's got a reputation as a saint. He praises Spencer in this obituary for discovering the organism-environment bond. And I think that that's the crucial thing in putting beings into the world. And then about new realism, the debates you rehearsed today are the ones that drove me to evolutionary theory. And once I got there, I never got out. But I'm just thinking in general at the end of this period, what you'd like to say about the relationship between Dewey and Woodbridge. I mean, the claim, as I understand it, and they were fighting with each other all the time, even though they were friends and members of the same department. Woodbridge was chair. Is that if you have an active, transformative relationship to a world because of the organism-environment bond, which is, by the way, the same claim that's being risen by the what do you call it, externality of the mind thesis of Andy Clark, like that.
Extended mind.
Basically the same claim. I'm sure there's differences, but Woodbridge said, I think that if you go down that road, you will not be able to basically have the contemplative view that qua philosophers should have. And they went back and forth on that for a long, long time. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I've edged into Woodbridge right now, and I've got a couple books sitting there that I'm trying to read. I'm trying to figure out where Woodbridge is in this whole thing. Like, he's kind of hosting this whole world at Columbia,
Yeah.
And they think of him as a realist. The new realists think of Woodbridge as one of them. He might not think of himself as one of them exactly. But now, okay, I think that evolution drives you immediately in a realist direction. And I think that these guys were all aware of that. Like, okay, so let's say your view is that we are constructing the reality that we're experiencing. Like, let's say, for example, that space and time do not exist externally to the mind, but are forms of human perception. Okay. Well, that's completely incompatible with Darwin, right? That's completely incompatible with natural selection. Why do we have the intelligence that we have? Because we're adapting to a real world. A universe, organism that created its own world couldn't survive more than a few minutes, okay? Like, yeah, like what kind of thing do you think we are? Like little gods or something? Like we're organisms scurrying around on the surface of a planet. All our faculties are designed to basically to allow us to detect features of that so we can avoid getting killed, okay? Like, so once you take that view, I don't see how you can go back to Hegel, okay? If you think that's true, then Hegel's false, okay? Like, even though Hegel has an evolutionary metaphysics. Or Kant, I think transcendental idealism is completely incompatible with the theory of evolution, like obvious, totally. That's part of why you get realists arising in the 20th century. Like out of the scientism. I mean, scientism sounds too, I do think I want it to be pejorative in a way. Like, I think this is a problem. Like, they're too science oriented. The whole thing is right then. But like, they're also trying to find a philosophy that's compatible with evolutionary biology and stuff like this, okay? And I think they're groping towards something that's at least a lot more plausible in that regard. I mean, maybe Dewey has something that will work in that regard too, right? But yeah, so that's key. Now, I don't know. I'm still grappling. I'm still trying to figure out who Woodbridge is and what his positions are exactly. You know what I mean? I've read some slices, but
the simplest clue is that he's an Aristotelian, and that means that your sensory experience will eventually get so processed that you can contemplate the nature of things in a reflexive way that's not related to praxis.
Yeah,
I think Dewey would deny that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen his. I guess I've edged into his argument that pragmatism is not sufficiently contemplative, right? That it's not. Yeah, that's in its practical orientation. It actually has no room for the key moment of withdrawal, right? Or almost solitude.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. But I don't think that he meant to be anti-action. He just didn't think it had stopped there.
Yeah.
Sunny.
Thank you.
I think my question has been answered.
Sunny.
Yeah, I think mine was a comment that was long ago. Yeah.
I will pull through your history story. I don't think the pragmatists ever took over the graduate programs because their students, as you're pointing out, went on to be non-pragmatists, and the same with Dewey. Very few Deweyians. And that's why when you have a cult feature of the analytic tradition, you can take over departments, as Ruth Marcus pointed out. Also, the world with the common sense theory and person. All of that aside, what is false? So I get your truth story.
Yes.
But where does the falsity come in if the world is true?
Yes. All right. These new realists have all really try to work on that. Okay. And I should try to pull out some actual passages. I think that this problem of error, the problem of the false, ended up, first of all, I think that is exactly why Moore and Russell withdrew the identity theory of truth, because they didn't think it could account for falsity. And the identity theory of truth is like what's true is the world, right? Okay, so what's the false? Right? The non-world, right? Like if Mont Blanc is a constituent of the proposition Mont Blanc is big or something like that, then all right. Yeah, so so how about the proposition Mont Blanc is small, or Mont Blanc is something false? Mont Blanc is a animal, something like that. Okay, so what is that? It's not I mean, is Mont Blanc the actual object a component of that assertion as well? Or of that proposition as well? Like the problem of error is that, yeah.
I want you to finish your statement. I just want to know that I have a question following up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I thought you were gonna help me out and save my butt from the problem of error.
Let's go back to the full stories about something like the Holocaust,
Yeah,
because one can tell a story in which you incorporate the whole situation. It starts with Versailles and it starts with reactions against communism and so forth, and lead us to Hitler and lead us to, I mean, we can tell that situational story. I don't know that it gets you a falsity about the Holocaust, but it gets you a different kind of truth about it. So, I mean, being able to say even simple perceptual things are false seems to be problematic when you can tell the situational story. And I'm in agreement with you from a pragmatic point of view about the situation being cheap and important in the environment. But there still seems to be a need for this is false.
yes.
In the case of the Holocaust story, I think some of these become socially very crucial, and we're in a period in which this has become absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and the Holocaust denial is real. It's that's true in that sense. Like it's if true and real were synonyms. Yes, and okay, so these people became aware, and Russell became extremely aware very quick that, and I think maybe Frager raised this as an objection, that an account of error had to be forthcoming. Like that's an interesting view of truth. Okay, I mean, I guess if I said the truth was true and real are synonyms, then untrue and unreal would be synonyms. But the question of how you can formulate a false proposition, if propositions are situations in the world, is difficult. Let's put it that way. Now, one thing I just say, like, I don't think I'm going to answer that, and in my head I want to, but I don't have in my head a good answer to that. But what I would say is, like, for example, Spaulding took a real run at that. Okay, like a big and Perry too, a long account of how, on extended mind identity theory of truth, a claim can turn out to be false, and what that means exactly. Okay, because again, every claim that has been made is real, and if real and true are synonyms, then every claim is made is true. In that sense, etc. This you got to say a lot. And I haven't worked this all out, but it's true that Russell and Moore dropped this approach because they couldn't answer that objection. In my heart and head, I think an answer must be forthcoming because I think this is a true theory of truth. But I haven't formulated it myself, and I haven't even adequately studied the answers that they did give because they knew that was a problem. And some of them did anyway, and they at least tried to address it. But yeah, okay, so you have other objections too.
All right, so I'm gonna frame this first with some of these questions may or may not be influenced by the fact that I watched Donnie Darko last night with my partner.
Oh, okay. That's been long for me. Yeah.
First time for me. Anyway, but that's not necessarily inherently related to this. In terms of environment, I think we also need to have some clarity on what new realists mean by environment. Are they talking about the entire physical material world? In which case is the unreal not that? Or is that too simplistic of a reduction? Subsequently, are we including time in this understanding of the environment? Because if we're including time in this, then we get into philosophy of time and it gets really messy really quick. And again, with the Donnie Darko reference, then is the unreal just all these continuity blips in our timeline of what we constitute as real, unreal, and hence we can have denial because we're remembering what is the unreal timeline.
Okay. This afternoon, that's the topic. I mean, I think I'm putting words in their mouth or speculating what they might say, and I should, read and reread. I think time is quite real. Objectively real in some sense, and not a form of consciousness primarily, and not affected by subjectivity, like an independent dimension. Now, if you tried the multiverse hypothesis on them or something like that, I have no idea what they might say, or what that would do to this concept of reality or whatever. I think basically though, they said this anyway. They regard space and time as objective dimensions that we experience more or less accurately on a good day, etc. So yes, then they recognize the objectivity of time, I guess, and then they're obliged to do. They would be obliged to do a whole bunch of work on that, and including the physics that has emerged since that and stuff, on time, I suppose.
And then I also want to point out that we need to be careful here, because are the new realists identifying true real synonym, untrue unreal synonyms as a ultimate in terms of logical, basic symbolic logic, like the universal? And that because we know in order to get a negation of the universal, we need to have the opposite, which is a specific case example that denies the general. Right? Because I think part of the issue with the error as well is the fact that if we're treating real and unreal as universal objectives, in the sense that universal claims and a logic problem, symbolic logic, we can't deny the other. There's no way to, because we don't have a specific that is based on the universal itself that negates the other.
So the unreal would be objective on this account, or something like that, and
correct.
And so then there would be no distinction between the real and the unreal.
That's also part of
the false.
That's also part of the problem with the error here.
Yeah,
they're both treating them as objective, as opposed to one being subordinated over the other. But then the question is, which one is subordinated?
Well, I guess you say the unreal is subordinated to the real. The unreal is just defined by its absence, this is the problem.
Yeah.
I'm referring to it, the unreal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what have I just referred to? And what, according to a new realist, have I just referred to? Well, I say the unreal is objective, or the unreal is not objective, yes. So, yeah, I guess this is going to sound half-assed, but I just acknowledge that there is a nest of problems in this specific area, in the area, on error. Okay, and that might actually betray a wider problem with the theory that detaches reality from consciousness in this principled way. Like maybe theories that don't do that can deal with error. They can't more smoothly or plausibly. Some of them can anyway. Yeah, so if I was going to put this forward, and I guess I have, I'm going to write a check here again for a theory of error, because I don't think it's in my book, actually. Even though the identification of truth and reality is definitely in my book. And maybe there was a half-assed paragraph or two on error. I need to review the literature, including the stuff in early Russell and early analytic philosophy on error, and the constraints that puts on a theory of truth. And then I have to wonder whether the identity theory can be formulated in a way that observes those constraints or not. I guess what I'm doing is admitting that there's a problem and admitting that they might be decisive actually. But hoping that I could address it.
Yeah, that's
With a
what,
year of work.
yeah, I'm not hoping to negate this. I'm hoping to help with
Yeah.
come to a conclusive understanding.
Well, thanks.
I think that's all the time we have today, so please join me in thanking Crispin.